Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. This is part 2 of a 3-part series on making a quilt for beginners, our Toss 9 patch. So last month, actually February 1st, 28 days ago, we learned how to make this 9-patch square. And your homework was to make 9 of these. Hopefully you got at least a couple made. What we're going to do today is we're going to cut it up and we're going to sew it back together in a different design. And then we're going to sew them together to make the quilt front and learn how to add borders. So to get started, we're going to go over to our cutting station and I'm going to show you how we will create our quilt square. What it's going to look like is this when we're done. So we'll go over to our cutting station and I've got a block sitting there. I just want to, when we started out making this block, we had 5-inch squares that we sewed together. We sewed a row. Well, actually, we sewed this row, this row, this row. And then we sewed them together to make the block. If you were to measure your blocks right now, if you used a proper 1/4-inch seam, this block is going to measure not 5 inches because we've lost a 1/4 of an inch in the seam. So this block is 4 3/4 inch. So is the green one. The white in the middle has 2 seams. So we've used up 1/4 inch and 1/4 inch. So we have a 4.5-inch square here. And what we're going to do is cut all the way down the middle of this block. 4.5 inches divided by 2 is 2 1/4 inches. So we're going to measure 2 1/4 inches across with our quilter's ruler, and we're going to cut it. Then we're going to rotate. And I have enough workspace right here where I can just rotate myself. And I'm going to come over and I'm going to cut the other direction. So we're basically cutting our block in half. I do not have you measure the whole block and find the half point, because where we need the precision on this block is our middle row. So we're going to measure from our seam lines. So if I bring in 1, 2 1/4 inch, and I'm going to line up my ruler on the edge of that red fabric and bring it all the way down. And sometimes, like I can see my 1/4 inch right here, I might have to scooch my fabric over a little. It's okay. Fabric's organic. We can pull it, scooch it a little into position. Now, if you're new to rotary cutting, you might not feel comfortable holding onto the ruler. Remember our kind of our crab hold, and then coming in with the ruler, drawing back and cutting away from yourself. You might not be comfortable doing that without drawing a line first. It's okay to pull out a chalk pen and draw a line down here. If that makes you more comfortable, just in case your ruler slides, you can help yourself get it back in place between your 1/4 mark here and your chalk line over here. The other thing you can do, especially if you're cutting and the light is not great in a room, when I'm cutting at night, it gets very dark in my sewing area, and I will have a hard time seeing these black tick marks on my ruler. So I will often take another ruler, lay it right on that 1/4 inch mark, and take a little Sharpie and draw down. I don't know if you can see that or not because it's a light purple, but I drew a purple line. And that just reminds me where my 1/4 inch mark is, so that if I'm getting tired, the light is dim, I have that purple line to line up with. So I'm on my 1, 2 1/4 inch mark. I'm going to bring my rotary cutter back a little and then down. And I've got a nice clean cut. Now I'm going to put that back in place. What I'm going to do now then is rotate my ruler and rotate my body and come on over here. Find that purple line I just drew. It's my 2 1/4 mark. That lines up quite nicely. Get a good firm hold on.
Hey, Becky,
Yes.
can you
Oh,
lean out of the view? There you go.
sorry.
It's hard to do sometimes. It's totally fine.
All right, so we're gonna, let me repeat. I lined up with that purple line, my 1/4 inch mark. I'm holding my ruler down. I'm gonna start about an inch in from the bottom, draw back, and then draw forward. And I now have 4 pieces. We're gonna do that with all 9 of our blocks that we sewed previously. And then this is where the fun happens, because this is where your creativity comes into play. In the old days, what a toss 9 patch was, they had 9 different fabrics that they sewed together, and it was all scraps. So it was, I chose to do a common white as a background. But the original toss 9 patch, it was all scrappy, all different fabrics. And so they would make a bunch of these squares and they would literally toss them in a bucket or a bag and mix it all up. And then they would just pull 4 squares out and rotate them and decide, well, did they want to rotate up this way, opposites, so that you get this bow tie look in the middle when you sew these together. If you can imagine all different colors around here, you can create quite an interesting quilt just by moving your squares around. You could move them all around and create a different look. So this is where your creativity comes into play. For this particular quilt, I kept my red and my yellow as is. And as I said before, there's the blue square in the middle. I just rotated them out. I've seen people do this where they rotate them just 1 turn of the clock to get different designs. So you can have an awful lot of fun laying all your squares out to create your own unique pattern.
Hey, Becky, we had a great question from Kathy that said, as a shortcut, could you stack the squares to cut them in half, or is that too risky, like cutting more than 1 block at a time?
For this quilt, I would not stack them because they're each gonna, they may be a little different. And I know for a fact, I just pulled this one out. I know that my seam is a little wide on the blue, so this doesn't quite measure 4 1/2. It's a little shy of it. It's hard when you stack fabrics. How are you, you'd have to make sure all these seams are lined up exactly all the way around. That's more trouble than just doing each of them alone and cutting. You'll get more precision. There are quilt projects called Stack and Wax. This is not one of them. Good question though. All right, so I have my 4 here, and before we go sewing them, I want to come back over to me for a second, and I want to look at the quilt behind me. So this is the quilt we're making with the red and the white, and here's your square. Except I'm upside down. I don't know if we can see this. This is the square that we're connecting all the way around. And remember, I had the 4 white squares as a common background. This quilt over here on this rack, this is a friend of mine named Barbara made this many years ago. And you'll notice there's more color variegations in here because she did not use a background square. All 9 of her squares were a different fabric. Many of them were in a beige tone, but every one of these fabrics has a tiny little pattern in it. And so it creates a scrappier look that is quite pretty when you see it close up. So these these toss nine patches are quite fun in that you think you are starting out with a certain look, and when you finish, you get maybe something a little different than you were expecting, but still just as beautiful. So what, going back to our square, we need to sew these together. We're going to sew the red to the green, the blue to the yellow. When you are making your quilt at home, you're going to have 9 reds stacked up in a pile, 9 greens, 9 blues, and 9 yellows. You want to leave them laid out in this configuration or whatever configuration you are going to sew. You're going to see it, you're going to flip it, and you're going to sew it. And I tend to see it twice because sometimes if I'm doing 3 things at once, I will forget which side I had to sew. I need to sew this side, not this side. So I see it, I flip it. I'm going to grab the side that I'm going to sew, and I'm going to bring it over to my machine. So coming over to my wonderful Fashion Mate, when you go to sew, you're going to want a pin. So I don't need to worry about nesting seams here because when we sew these 2 sides together, there are no seams that are going to line up. So I'm going to line up the end of one side and put a pin in there. And I want to get a pin on the other side. Now, if you are new to sewing, you may want to put another pin in the middle because it's important that these edges line up as well. They can sometimes wander a little bit in the sewing process. So 3 pins, beginning, middle, end. If you've been doing a lot of sewing on your machine, make sure your needle is still sharp and doesn't need replacing. I've got the Singer Universal titaniums in here. It's an 8014, which is a normal sewing needle. And I'm going to pull that first pin out once I get it under the foot. Let's see how close we can get this camera in here. And I'm going to sew these together. Remember, the 1/4 inch foot here has that little flange that comes out to remind you where your 1/4 inch is. And pull that pin out before the needle hits it. You'll dull your needles if you sew over them. And you could break them as well. And there we go. It's not a race. Take your time. When I'm done, I can come up, whoop, and cut it. There we go. There's my 1/4 inch seam. And if I open this up, you know, I've got a nice seam there. I'm going to set that aside for a moment over by my cutting station. So it looks the way it's supposed to look. So now I'm going to take this next piece, blue to the yellow. So the blue is sewn to the blue dark center. And so I will, again, put my pins in. The ends in the middle so that I get a nice straight intersection there. And I like to start with my needle down, so I moved it down. Whoop. Now here's something. I don't know if you can see what just happened. So when you are sewing, and as you start to sew quilt squares together, there are seams that are opener to the side, and sometimes you are sewing against them. So you see how that popped up? I stopped sewing, and you can, your seam ripper works or a stylus works just to push that back under there. Because we want those seams to lay flat so that when we get into the quilting process, our quilt lies flat. Looks like I might have pinned a little crooked there. I'm going to make a correction. And so there we go. Okay. And look at that. I didn't sew right there. Okay, we'll put it back in and fix that. Okay. So now, before I go any further, I've got two halves sewn together. And they're sewn together. That's the way they need to look. Before I can sew this row to this row, I need to do some pressing. So we're going to take these over to our ironing station. And in the write-up, I show the direction of ironing. What we want to do is make sure that our seams are being ironed in opposite directions. So I set this up to iron away from the dark blue center. So in this case, ironing towards the green, and on the bottom or top piece, the blue piece here towards the blue flowers. So but first, if you remember from last time, you're going to take your iron and press the seam. That sets the stitches. Then I can flip it over, and I want to iron towards that blue square. Just want to get those threads out of there. So I finger press it and then just set my iron on. If you had pre-starched your fabrics, like we talked about last time, this should lay down pretty nicely. If you're having trouble getting it to lay down, you can hit it with a little water. I don't put water in my iron because I have well water, and that's not good for your irons. So I just have a bottle of water that I use to squirt, and I can put a little water there, or I can use spray starch. And so I iron that side, and then I do have a tendency to come and just give the front a quick press. So there's my blue and yellow. This one I'm going to press towards my green. So set my seam first, and then press towards the green. And I'll show you in a second. If we line these up, I've got this seam going towards the green this way, this seam going towards the blue. So they're going opposite directions. So when I go to sew these together now, we're going to be able to nest those seams. So again, I'm going to see it, flip it, and sew it. So in order to try to show you this, I'm nesting the seams. I don't know if you can see, they butt right against each other. And I want to pin that. When you pin these, you don't want to pin right on the seam. You want to pin about 1/4 of an inch, maybe 1/2 inch on each side of it, so that you're not pinning through that intersection, but you're pinning on each side. So I put 2 pins in, and then I'm going to add a pin on this end, and then a pin on this end, matching my ends. And we are now going to sew a 1/4 inch seam. Then I'm going to bring my needle down, pull that first pin out, and sew. And sometimes I stop and check. Yeah, it looks like we're still lined up. And I want to watch this seam down here is pointing towards my foot, which means there's going to be a tendency for it to flip up. So I just want to be careful when I get close to that spot to slow down and keep it flat. Now, some people may feel uncomfortable getting their fingers in there, which is why they have things like the point of a seam ripper or a stylus, where you can use that to flatten, push a seam down as you're sewing. Which, so I have a little seam that is trying to peek out. So like that seam wants to come up. So I'm just raise my foot, put that seam back in place. Let's get my needle out of there. And cut my thread. This, I'm sewing slower with this than I did the original 9 patches I was sewing, because it's important to make sure your seams are sewn in the direction that you ironed them. It's very easy for them to flip up when you're sewing multiple rows together, and you want to try to keep them in the same direction, because now when I go to my ironing station, it'll be a lot easier for me to iron, and I'm going to get a nice flat seam. So again, we press to set those stitches, and then I'm going to iron them open. Taking the time to press open these seams is important for a couple of reasons. One, there's a lot of bulk in here, especially in the middle. If you look, we get this cute little, like 4-patch. You have a little intersection there in the middle, but there is 4 or 5 layers of fabric in this area on each side of the seam. There's 5 layers at least. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so it can get quite thick when you're quilting this in our next session. You'll have this top, you'll have the batting, and you'll have the backing fabric. So you're going to be sewing through 7 different layers. So we try to reduce the bulk of seams like this by pressing them open. So you can come in with your fingers and do a finger press first, which helps hold it open. And then you have to very carefully work your iron through. And notice I'm pressing, I'm not ironing, I just press. You can use a tool. It's just a piece of wood that's rounded. You might even have one in your garage. A quarter round works. But if you put it on the wood, it just naturally opens the seam. It's pretty nice. So I'm pressing this seam open. And every seam we do after this, we are pressing open to reduce bulk. So I get that pressed, and then I flip it over, and I'm just going to give it a nice press on this side. And this is your tossed 9 patch, because we tossed our blue and green. Okay, so you have 9 of the original 9 blocks. You're going to turn them into 9 of these. Once you do that, you're going to lay your blocks out in a manner that is pleasing to you. So I'm actually just pulling in from the write-up. I'm going to bring it close to the camera. So this is a picture of, there it is, the 9 that I laid out. This is the pattern I chose. You could choose to do a different pattern, lay them out on the floor, move them around, stand back 4 feet and say, hey, I like it. Or, oh, let me move this block or that block. This is where you can really let your creativity take hold and have a great time moving blocks around. So I kept mine uniform like this and I sewed them together. Now, when you sew them together, so I've got 2 that I've sewn together here to show you because it's a little easier to see than a 9x9. First square, second square, this is the seam that was sewn. And again, I pressed the seam open. You're going to have 3 of these across to make a row. Once you have 3 rows of 3, then you need to join your rows. It's the same process, but you're dealing with larger pieces of fabric. So go over to the cutting station to show you because I have a little wider view here. This is just 2 pieces. You will have a third. I'm going to bring in my second piece. And what I have to do is I'm going to see my pattern. I'm going to flip it and I'm going to sew it. But we will use a lot of pins in this step. The important places to get good intersections are our blue bow ties here and our inner seams that line up, like here and here. So when I am getting ready to do this, I'm going to flip my row and I'm actually going to start in the middle with my bow tie. And I'm going to nest that seam and get a couple of pins in there, just like I did when I was joining the rows. But we're going to nest those seams to secure that. I'm going to match the common background seam over here. Get a pin on each side. And then I'm going to go and match my end with a pin. That's part of it. I'm going to do that for the entire row. This is not a step to be rushed. Use as many pins as you need. I know some people like to use clips. If you wanted to clip, like here, this is not a spot where I'm lining up any seams. If you wanted to use a clip, when I say clips, I mean things like this. Some people love these things. If you want to put a clip there, that's fine. But when you are nesting seams, you really want a precision pin with your pins there. I learned to sew with pins, so I'm very comfortable with them, but not everybody loves using pins. The clips are marvelous, especially when you have something quick you need to sew together. So I've moved some pins along here, and I need to sew this together. So you're going to do this for all 3 of your rows. Don't rush it. You want to sew. You want to press your seam open and then go add the other row. To a seam that I want to make sure is going to keep running the direction I ironed it. I'm going to pull out my stiletto here, or the tip of my seam ripper works, and just keep it in place while I sew over that intersection. So I hope you, this is the middle intersection. Here is where I'm at. This is the thickest spot. So I did stop, pause a little bit, make sure I'm in the right position. Looks like I need to make a little adjustment there. And sew along. That pin got away from me. And here, look, that one's trying, that little seam's trying to come up. Let's push it back down. And now when I get towards the end, this is what happens. You'll see that there's a little blue and white peeking out because I didn't have a pin there. You know, fabric moves. So you take your time, make adjustments as needed. And it looks like I really need to. I'm going to take the time to repin that. Put my pin out. And match me. Okay, so we have sewn two together. And now sometimes things like this happens. I'm gonna point out right up here. So I had this side visible when I was sewing, and all my seams are going the direction that they were pressed. But look what happened in the middle on the other side. This flipped over. So that's a case where, and it's so easy for it to happen when we have a lot of seams. I just go in with my seam ripper, and which I seem to have misplaced at the moment, but I would go in with my, oh, here it is. Okay, seam ripper, and I can just take a couple of those out, go back under the machine and sew it in the right direction. And it's worth it to take the time to do that because we want our flat seams. So I'm not going to do it today because I know we're on a time limit, but I will fix it afterwards. What I want to show you now is the pressing. So we're still doing the same pressing. Got my Singer iron. I set those stitches and then I am going to finger press it. But before I do that, I should look at the other side. Look at what we did. We've got a lovely bow tie intersection here. And if you had a third row on the other side, you'd have another one. You're going to press this seam open just like we did the individual blocks. Press it open with your, move it open with your fingers, and then bring your iron along to press open. This is one of those things that says, I sewed faster than I ironed. Pressing open takes some time, but it's so worth it in the end to get a good flat seam. Bethany, do we have any questions while I finish this seam?
No, it seems like everybody's following along great. You're doing a great job.
Okay, I'm trying to press fast. One more little bit here. And then I'm gonna hit the other side with the iron, press it, just a nice quick press on the front, because we will talk about adding borders to this. So when you do the 9x9, it's a nice little lap quilt, baby quilt, wall hanging. This 4x4, I mean, to me, this 4x4 makes, it's a nice table cover. You could put it on your dining room table and it covers it nicely, or on a living room table. It also makes a cute little wall hanging. If you just do two of them sewn together, you have a table runner, which this is. So there's so many things you can do with these blocks to make decorative items for around your house or for gifts for people. The 9x9 behind me is easy to turn into a full size bed, a queen size, a king size, simply by adding more blocks across and down. So once you have your 9 blocks sewn together, 3 across each row for a total of 9, then what we have to do is apply borders. So I want to talk about borders a little bit. We're going to go to the ironing station. The first border on this quilt is this thin yellow border, okay? And it's 1.5, you cut a 1.5 inch strip, I believe, 1 1/4 or 1.5. I can measure mine. Yeah, it's 1.5. Once it's sewn in, it becomes a 1 inch border because you've sewn on both sides. And then you have an outer border in navy blue. When you add borders, it's really important that you use spray starch to prep your strips. So when you're getting ready to cut strips, and we did talk in the first session about prepping fabric and cutting, but before you ever cut these 1.5 inch strips, you want to make sure that you've given it a good press with a spray starch. The reason for that is when you come in with your rotary cutter and you're cutting, it's very easy for thin strips especially to, I call it wobble, but you'll get a less accurate cut all the way down. And where this may be 1.5, maybe up further, it's a little less than 1.5 or a little more than 1.5. And in your finished project, when the finished strip is 1 inch, you really want it to look very accurate coming down and not have it be 1 inch in one spot and 1 1/4 in another and, you know, skinnier another, because it'll you won't have that symmetrical border going around your quilt. So spray starch is your best friend for cutting your strips. When you are making something small, like this 4x4, I can get a strip cut that goes from end to end without having to piece it. But when you're making a quilt, you're going to have to piece your borders. So we're going to talk about how to piece the borders, and then we're going to talk about how you measure your quilt for determining the length of your borders. When you are piecing borders, beginner quilters have a tendency to say, oh, I will just do a straight stitch. I'll flip it and I'll sew a 1/4 inch strip and you have a straight seam. Don't do that. The better way to do it is this. You have your strip and you lay the other strip face down on it. Now, you can go right to the edge. I go over just a little bit because I like to see where my corners are. So I've got these two strips at a 45-degree angle. And then I'm going to grab my 1/4 inch ruler, or any ruler for that matter, that you can get a good line. And I'm going to run my ruler from corner, here's my corner, to the other corner. So what I've done is I've drawn a 1/4 inch, or I've drawn a diagonal line at a 45-degree. And I'm going to put a pin in crossways like that. And I'm going to sew that. And I'm actually, so I have to tell you, the camera is backwards from what I'm looking at. And so I'm going to flip it around to my right-handed view. So, and then let me redo this so that it looks correctly for you. So if you're right-handed, it looks like this. So I'm going to draw my line corner to corner. There it is. Because what's going to happen is we're going to sew on this line, cut it to a 1/4 inch. We'll sew here. We'll trim over here. And when you fold it back, when we iron it back, you're going to have a 45-degree angled seam. Those are stronger than a straight seam. So left to right, and then I'm going to come over to my sewing machine, and I'm going to sew right on that line. So if I line up the pen line I just drew right in the opening of that 1/4-inch foot, I don't know if you can see that or not, but it is right, the line is right there where my needle is. And I'm going to start sewing, pull my pin out. There we go. And I've sewn along that line. Then I can take my 1/4-inch ruler and my rotary cutter, and make sure you're cutting on the proper side. You want to cut to the outside. We're cutting that little tail off, 1/4-inch. And that's a nice 1/4-inch seam. I also cut off the dog ear. And then I'm going to come back over to my iron. And here's where you have a choice. So I can set the seam. And some people like to press these to one side. I have started pressing them open because it gives me less bulk in the intersection. So it's pressed, and I've now, except for the dog ear I need to get rid of, I've joined and made a longer inner border for my quilt. You're going to do the same thing with the blue fabric. With the blue fabric, it's not any harder, it's just wider. So when I am working these, you do your right angle, you place your ruler down, you draw your line. I need a longer ruler for this one, don't I? There we go. And I'm going to draw it, draw my line, and sew it. And it's the same approach. You know, sew right on that line, and cut your outside bulk. And I've walked it backwards. Here we go. Sew right on that line. You'll cut this piece off, and you will have a nice 45-degree seam angle. So that's how you make longer borders. Now, the length of border that you need is something that's important to talk about. So I'm going to go to the cutting station for this. So if we bring our 4x4 over, and I know it doesn't all fit in the camera, so we'll focus on this corner right here where my left hand is. When you make a quilt, the more pieces that are in it, the more rows, the more blocks that are in it, that's the more seams that are in the quilt. And every time you add a seam to a quilt, you're gonna have a difference in measurements between blocks. It's just natural, it happens. So when I am measuring to put borders on, the first thing I do is I take out a tape measure and I measure the middle from end to end. So this one is 26 inches across the middle. Then I measure the top. And let's see, the top of this one that we sewed today is, oh, my camera went out. I don't know why. Oh, something, there we go. The top measures 26 and a quarter. So the top of my quilt is a 1/4 inch larger than the middle. That's okay. And then I'm going to come down to the bottom and measure, and it is almost 26. It's 25 and 7/8. So I have this quilt top here that has 3 different measurements in the middle. So it's, let's look at this. So I measured across here and it's 26. I measured up here and it's 26 and a quarter. And down here, what did it say? 25 and 7/8. It's almost 26. So what do I do when I want to measure borders? What I do is I'm going to take these 3 measurements and I'm going to average them up. So, and the average will be the length of border that I'm going to cut. So you would add the 3 numbers together, divide by 3, and that would give you the border, which is going to be, and then you round it to the nearest 1/4 inch. So we're going to end up with 26 this way. The convention when you add a border to a quilt is this. So we're going to draw this quilt again. The convention is that you add the sides first. So this would be my yellow border, my yellow border. So in order to add those first, I would measure the length, right, in 3 spots and pick my average, and that would be the length of my yellow borders. When I'm adding those on, I'm going to find the middle point of my quilt and the middle point of my border, and I'm going to pin it right there. And then I'm going to pin the end and this end, and then work it in. You might have to work in a little bit of ease, as they say, if your border, or you might have to give it a small stretch. It's not going to be a lot, just a little bit of a pull. But you do it the same on both sides. The reason for this, the reason you don't just lay fabric down and start sewing until you get to the end and it's done, is that when your lengths are different, if you don't measure and take an average, you run the risk of getting what we call is lettucing or a little ruffling on your outside borders, which will interfere when you're trying to quilt your quilt. So you add your sides first, then you're going to go and measure 3 ways this way, right? And we're going to add our top yellow border and our bottom yellow border. And then you go and do the same thing with the blue border. And when you're done, you will have a quilt with the yellow border, nice and straight. And this is, I quilted this on the Singer Fashion Mate, lays nice and flat. And the blue, no ruffling, laid nice and flat because I measured 3 ways on each direction and took the average to measure the length of my yellow inner border and the length of my outer blue border. This quilt's pretty forgiving when it comes to measurements and lengths, but as your skills grow and you move to making other quilts that are more intricate, this 3-way measurement, both directions, will really help you get a better product at the end. There's nothing wrong with piecing the borders. On this blue border back here, I did not have length long enough, right? So I do have my 45-degree angled seams in the blue and in some of the yellow. But once you're done quilting, you can't even tell. Nobody sees them. When you are adding your border, here's my 4-piece, here it is. Don't underestimate the amount of pins you will need and take your time pinning. So if we come over to this view, I think this is the one I pre-measured. So when I find the middle of my quilt, I fold it in half. And here's my midpoint. And I just line it up with that midpoint fold. Open it up. And I put a couple of pins there, making sure that, oh, wrong sides together. Making sure the edges are aligned, and I've lined my middle up. So in the middle, then pin the ends. You pin your end, and then I would put a pin every 2 inches or so, because it's very easy for these borders to wander away from the edge or over the edge of your quilt as you're sewing, just from the movement of the feed dogs going through the machine. So use enough pins to keep that thing in place. When I sew it with my border on top. You can sew it this way, especially if you're worried about these seams and your border on the bottom. There's opinions about which way is best on top. It depends on the quilt and where the precisely cut piece is. With all the seams on this, I'm tempted to sew it with my border underneath and these on top so that I can keep my seams running the proper direction. Once it's sewn on, you are pressing your seams towards your border because your border doesn't have any bulk. So you press your seam so that it's going towards the border. We're not adding bulk to the quilt anymore. The bulk will be on the border side. And then when you add your blue border, you press to the dark side again, you press to your blue border, your outer border. When you are adding the blue border, we're not doing mitered corners. There's no need to do a mitered corner for this quilt. So you will end up, actually, I'll just pull this out. You can see, here's my corner. My yellow, you can see where they joined right here. And my blue border as well. I sewed, this was the side to here, and then the top. And it's a straight border over. Any questions out there, Bethany?
No questions. We got a thank you for the tip on averaging measuring sides. So that was very helpful to see that. And I think everybody's excited for part 3.
Okay. Let me talk a little bit about that part 3 because there's homework, right? You have to make your top. You have to join those 9 blocks. You have to join those 9 blocks. You have to add your borders. And you need a couple of different materials for part 3. In part 3, we're going to make the quilt sandwich. So you will need fabric for the back of your quilt. I will say a word about it. The back of your quilt does not have to match the front of your quilt. It's the back of the quilt. I used on this one, this cool bird fabric that I found in my stash. I had forgotten I had it. I think I've had this fabric 15 years. And I put it on the back of my table runner version of this, and it's fun. It's fun fabric. I can use both sides of my table runner. So you need backing fabric. You also will need a walking foot. So for my Singer Fashion Mate, the even feed foot looks like this, which you can get at Michael's. This thing works fabulous. When I was quilting with this, I really enjoyed how nicely it ran. So you'll need that. And because quilting, you're quilting through multiple layers, we recommend the quilting needles. So those are things you can start to gather. The other thing you're going to need is tape, painter's tape, masking tape, some kind of temporary, easy to remove, non-damaging tape. You probably have somewhere buried in a drawer somewhere, right? So those are some things that you can gather for next time. The class is on March, it's the last Thursday in March. So
March 28th.
March
At
20th.
noon Central. I did link the class for people to sign up. It's in the chat, so be sure to go sign up for it when this class ends in just a minute. And in there, you'll find that supply list that Becky was running through.
Yeah. Okay. And thank you, everybody, for joining. I hope it was helpful.